Good evening to everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in. I'm really excited that you could be here on this nice sunny evening in Scotland or wherever you've tuned in from around the world or in the UK. So the Scottish Books Long Weekend is a special online event that celebrates Scotland's books, authors and publishers. It's brought to you by Publishing Scotland and Books from Scotland with support from Creative Scotland. So the events over this weekend will have been full of discussions. There's 4 more tomorrow after this event, and discussions around fiction, non-fiction, children and YA books. And if you want to see more, go to booksfromscotland.com. Now you can also check the online bookshop. We're using bookshop.org, which of course supports independent bookshops in the UK, and look specifically for the Scottish Books Long Weekend for the books that have been discussed during this weekend. Now 10% of the sales goes to Publishing Scotland's work to promote Scottish books. And if you want to go onto Twitter, look for @ScottishBooks. If you want to go on Instagram, it's @BooksFromScotland. And if you want to hashtag anything about this event or other events, then you're going to use the hashtag ScotBooks and the hashtag ScotBooksLongWeekend. And that's all one. So I'm thrilled to be here with this evening with author Alex Renton, who has just published this book in the last month, Blood Legacy. So we're going to be talking about his book and talking about how he came to write this book in the first place. So I'd love to welcome Alex Renton to this event, and I would love to ask you, first of all, once you've unmuted yourself, Alex, I'd love to ask you about how you actually began the journey of writing your latest book, Blood Legacy.
Yes, it started with finding something in a cellar. My grandfather was quite well known in the mid 20th century Scottish historian, and also the latest in a long line of Ayrshire Scots who'd been quite influential really from the 17th century onwards as lawyers and members of parliament and soldiers. And his hobby was collecting the family records and cataloguing him, and it's kind of, some of his books were based on them. And so I was looking through some of his catalogues, and I just kept coming across the word Jamaica and Tobago, and I was intrigued, and I found my mother said that she did know a little about this, and that her father had told her that, and shown us some documents, including some lists of enslaved people, but said everyone was at it, meaning everyone like them in the 18th century, and that the Fergusons didn't do it for very long and didn't make much money, and she shouldn't, although she was obviously horrified, she shouldn't worry too much about it. So it was really from there. So I started reading the papers, and I'm an investigative journalist. I couldn't possibly not look. And I'm also, someone who is a journalist, has sort of worked often abroad in places, which are still bearing the trauma and the scars of having been ruled by the British imperial system. So and I was aware, that my very expensive private education had told me very little about slavery or indeed the empire. So this is all interesting. But the first thing that immediately grabbed me was that the letters I were reading were very much from people who seemed to be part of my philosophical, moral culture 250 years ago, but they didn't seem very different from me. And that was a really big shock, and that made me start thinking.
Sure, thank you. And for people that don't know you, then, I need to say that you've been a journalist for many years. You're an author of other books. You've won awards for your work as an investigator, war correspondent and food policy writer. And then you've worked for Oxfam in East Asia and Haiti and on the Iraq War, and that you were living in Edinburgh at the moment. But this was quite a departure, really quite a big departure from the other work that you've done. And I know one of the things that we've spoken about is the fact that one, it's quite a shock coming across this in your own family, but also coming to terms as somebody who his family is from Scotland and understanding the huge involvement of Scots in the slave trade system and colonialism more generally. And how prevalent is it amongst, let's say, your peers and the kinds of people that you grew up with and you associate with? How much knowledge do you find there's out there about this particular subject? Do you find that generally it's very lacking, that people don't really have the first clue about it? Or is that starting to change now, if that's the case?
Well, my son's just left school in Edinburgh, and my daughter's at school now, and she knows 100 times more about the history of British Caribbean slavery, and indeed about the reality of the empire than I did. I did 2 history O levels. I went to Eton for a while, and I had the best education money can buy in the 20th century Britain, and I was fantastically ignorant. I knew an awful lot about the causes of the First World War, but I really knew nothing about Caribbean slavery other than Wilberforce 1807. And I think that's true, not just of my generation, but everyone who grew up in the 20th century. And I sometimes dispute, since I started this project 4 years ago, this issue with educated people like me, white, middle-aged, middle-class people. And so I go, okay, right, let's do a little quiz. What, can you tell me the date that British slavery ended? Can you tell me how many Africans the British transported enslaved across the Atlantic? Can you tell me where we rank among the 11 European nations who enslaved people? And literally 1 in 10 gets anywhere near the date. And that it's 3.25 million Africans. Most of them say, well, maybe 100,000.
Wow.
And that only the Portuguese shipped more than the British. People just don't know. And the funny thing after that is they're not that ashamed. In fact, many of them start defending their education and defending the fact that they don't know this crucial part of our history. And telling me how unimportant it is and how it's all over, which is not someone in America an American would tell you, where they know it ended in 1865 with the Civil War, and clearly still toxifies and drives a lot of what goes on in that country. Only 30 years earlier here, but we've forgotten it.
I think that's been quite shocking for me, actually, just from the kind of work that I do as one of many people educating Scottish people in Edinburgh, people specifically about the links to the Caribbean and slavery and colonialism, is that the amount of people that turn around and say, I knew nothing of this at all, and now I have to look at my city with completely new eyes. And I think there was a part of me that was, I do understand that, but I think there was a small part of me that felt a little bit curious and impatient and a bit kind of like, why have you not had the curiosity to go and look for yourself, knowing that we've had, as I say to people, I don't say it to people on the tours, but that we've had Google for 20 years, and to have the curiosity to find out, to think, well, how did we manage to develop in the way that we did? Why are our countries suffering from such levels of poverty? And I suppose in the media, we do have a biased media that generally doesn't promote these kinds of stories until the last few years, even though people have been trying for decades, especially Caribbean scholars in Britain have been trying to push this for the longest while. But I suppose I've had to come to terms with the fact that people talk about this idea of historical amnesia, and maybe that's something that we can kind of deconstruct or discuss a little bit, because I think sometimes there are quite deliberate omissions. Like, people actually sometimes have that knowledge and they gatekeep the knowledge. They decide it's upsetting, they decide the public's not ready for it, they make some kind of decision on holding back that knowledge in areas where they could have a very, very big reach.
I mean, I think you're very mild in your reaction. if I were the descendant of enslaved people, I would be very angry that the nation that had done this to my ancestors and then suppressed their history and rewritten it to make the white people look like the heroes of the anti-slavery movement, and then spent an awful lot of time, as we have in the 20th century, telling people of African and Caribbean origin to get over it and that they're actually very lucky. I would be absolutely furious. I mean, I think what we're looking at is one of the great acts of amnesia is a really polite way of putting it. This is willful, deliberate obscurantism. And I think quite clearly, as far as the empire, the modern history of Britain, starting from the 18th century is concerned, we were fed propaganda in a North Korean style way. And interestingly, I mean, I was lucky enough in the book to be able to look at post-emancipation a bit, because my ancestors, the Fergusons, owned the plantation in Jamaica right through to 1875. And were even more ignorant about what happened after we, I quote, gave the slaves their freedom. We then abandoned those Caribbean nations, stopped buying their sugar, and left them really to rot. There was mass starvation in Barbados and Jamaica during the later 19th century, and then uprisings and land grab riots that were put down with unbelievable savagery. Another history unreported. So it's when what I find really unacceptable about the reaction of my class and people like me to the questioning of this history that's arisen in the last year since Black Lives Matter and the fall of the Colson statue is this absolute refusal even to entertain the fact that the history they might have been given was severely lacking. The fury of the reaction, and I get this myself now because of writing in newspapers about this story, is again another sign of something really quite unhealthy going on about how we deal with our past, our recent past.
I'll tell you where I see the difference. For example, and again, it's a great project that should definitely happen, but the project around what happened to the witches in Edinburgh, so the burning of so-called witches in Edinburgh, and hoping to have a memorial and really start to look into that history a lot more and highlight it. And there's been absolutely nothing of the kind of backlash that you would have over Caribbean or any kind of slavery or colonialism. And I've actually asked them, I said, have you had any kind of people saying, we mustn't talk about this is divisive, this is in the past, why should we memorialize it? Nothing at all.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And there's a stark difference, for a similar kind of proposal.
But I think the very people who get angry with me about this, and I'm lucky, I'm a white person with, I know writers who are of color who are friends and who I talk to a lot. They get the same anger, but it's with a overt racist attack attached to it, and really, really nasty as well. These are commentators in the pages of the Times and so on. But but what I find particularly distressing really is that having people who've arrived at the point where they're able to say that you shouldn't discuss this history go on retelling the lies about the history. So the people who try to defend the history as they learnt it will then retell the lies. So and start giving you again, and I've read 3 newspaper columnists, including Jeremy Clarkson in the Sunday Times recently, who stated that historians had told him that the British spent more money policing the slave trade in the later 19th century than they'd made in the 250 years of British slavery in the Caribbean. And this sort of stuff is churned out by right-wing columnists in popular newspapers without any questioning whatsoever, because there isn't the mechanism there to question it, or people are too frightened of being called woke. But it's a patent, absolute lie. It's propaganda. The slavery industries were worth 12% of GDP to Britain around in 1800 and around then. The Royal Navy's actions on the west coast of Africa, however laudable, cost nothing like what we earned from 3.25 million Africans and their descendants enslaved, plus all the Scottish herring and the linen that we sold to the Caribbean to clothe and feed the slaves, and the guns that we made in Birmingham to swap for Africans on the west coast of Africa. So it's not just amnesia; it is an aggressive fight to keep the history up, and that's most obviously seen in the fight, particularly in this city, to keep plaques unaltered. Which, when you look at it, anyway, there's a further subject.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. So I think it is a quite traumatic read. I mean, anything that is truthful about this subject, when you have to go into certain details for people that are unaware of the history, or they don't seem to care, or they don't think that it's important, maybe because they don't know of the actual horrors of what went on. And of course, we will never know the full horrors, having, not living through it ourselves. But it's difficult sometimes. I mean, even when I'm doing my walks there, I don't want to re-traumatize people of Caribbean background. I mean, in my own background, I have a range of different ancestors, like a lot of Caribbean people do. So, some of my ancestors were enslaved, some of my ancestors were enslavers, some of my ancestors nothing to do with that part of history at all. But I'm careful that I don't want to re-traumatize people on a walk, and I try to relay the information in a way that is uplifting. We talk about resistance, and we talk about those centuries of resistance and those heroes on the other end fighting against the people who were being oppressed by the people who were celebrated in the statues in this city. And I think it comes up, we've had conversations, or when you've been talking to people in the Caribbean who don't necessarily want to go and revisit the horror and the trauma and the details of that history. And I realized this book is really meant for a specific audience who, like you were saying, don't know this history, don't consider it important. So you have to talk about the horrors and the trauma for them to really get it and to understand that. And what I appreciate about the book, I think, as well, is the fact that you go out to the Caribbean, you go back to the plantations that your family owned, and you walk the land, you get a sense of the place, but you actually talk to the people on the ground as well, and try to get a sense of how people feel about things now, but also to understand the reality of the Caribbean, the underdevelopment, the structural underdevelopment that came out from this, and how slavery morphed into colonialism, neo-colonialism, and so on. And the fact that we get to independence, and we get political independence, but not economic independence, and we have the results of that very, very clearly, and people suffering lots of different ways. So I'm thinking about, let's say, when I had an evening with Jim Walvin, who's one of our main global scholars when it comes to Caribbean slavery. And I remember him saying, even before he started his research fully, it wasn't until he went to Jamaica and spent time there, and he's looking at Britain from that perspective and being around people, conversations in the Caribbean, it wasn't until that point that he really understood the importance of really making sure that we understand this kind of history. And I was wondering for you, how you felt actually going to the Caribbean now, having this knowledge about your family and your own emotional journey while you're actually, walking those places and speaking to people.
I mean, it was clear to me from the beginning that I had to go, and I wanted to. And I think, and one of the things that really struck me was that apart from 4 years, so the family owned 2 plantations, one in Tobago for about 30 years, and one in Jamaica for 115 years. And that apart from 4 years when my 6 times great uncle went to Tobago and started that plantation, along with 70 Africans who he bought, none of us had ever been. We were the absolute absentee landlords. So we offshored this stuff, which presumably made it more acceptable to my grandfathers because they didn't have to see or smell it. And so, clearly I had to go. And as a journalist, obviously I had to go. I think, the first time I trod, with my wife and daughter who came with me to Tobago, and we were at the plantation in Tobago where in 1774, my six times great uncle, James Ferguson, aged 26, had started with the help of these Africans, the enforced help of these Africans, to hack out a plantation from the naked jungle. We actually finally stood there in this sort of slightly desolate place where, which has never managed to successfully have a farm. It was very moving indeed, and I the first time I spoke to some people there who I then became quite friendly with, who do operate a small dasheen farm on a government plot down by the river. And said why I was there and what I was looking for. It was a huge moment. But there and in Jamaica, people were, generous, kind, pleased that I'd come and was asking the questions, giving. I'm in touch with them. I've been trying to get copies of the book out to them, and very frank. Because the two questions that you had to ask were, one is, what does it mean to you today? What do you think I should do? People like me should do, and the other is, how does slavery still affect you? And those were two huge learning experiences for me. And one is, that clearly you could not put a case why I and people like me and my country, Scotland, should be so much wealthier than Tobago or Jamaica, which are, in many ways, Scottish places from the DNA and the place names. And secondly, how the structures that my ancestors and the British colonial administration put in place there to enslave people are still constraining lives, particularly colorism. It's the one thing everybody mentions out there, as I'm sure you know. And I know from reading my ancestors' letters that the mixed race children that came out of what you have to presume are rapes by the white Scottish staff on the black enslaved women, had a higher status, and that remains true today. So I felt very in touch. It was very meaningful. And in the book, there are a lot of interviews there. What was an enormous relief is that in some ways there are good things happening there. I talk to people who have good lives in the place where my ancestors killed hundreds of people. But I haven't yet processed it yet. But hey, this is not about my suffering. It's I had the privilege to be able to go and do this, and I have the immense privilege of having access to this story through the papers, but also I know who my ancestors were and what happened to them and what they did, and whether they have happy lives or bad. Everyone I spoke to has no idea what happened to their ancestors and can only think, and this must be so traumatizing, what horrors, because they know there must have been horrors, came through. It were done to people not so long ago, grandfathers, and I think that comes back to this issue about the horror that I tell in the book. And I think, a friend, we were talking about this the other day, said, don't you think there should be a color warning? A trigger warning.
Yeah.
Particularly for people with enslaved ancestors to think of, and there kind of should be, but I knew I had to put that horror in because I've met so many, and this will shock you, I think, so many educated people of my type who go, "Oh, are you sure it was that bad on the plantations?" Clearly some bad things happened, but might not most of them have been better off than they were in Africa? Honestly, you hear it again and again, and the irony of that is, Lisa, is that the same argument was used in 1790 by the pro-slavery lobby, saying there's no need to abolish it. They have a better life on our plantations than the poor do in England. But it's it's tosh, it's nonsense. And you can see, and that's why I'm really glad to have the papers that my ancestors wrote, these dry documents and accounts books, because you can see the 4-year average life of the adults, the 1 in 20 children who makes it from to adults, the ridiculous waste of, the using of people's lives and then the replacing them with new ones like a worn out tractor. The breeding, my Enlightenment ancestors, Scottish Enlightenment ancestors with their education and their Christianity, who could look at the progress of the abolition of the slave trade bill in the 1790s and write to the Scottish managers in Jamaica and go, quick, buy more young girls. Yeah. Breed more babies because the price is going up.
Yeah, awful.
So you need to tell people, even today, people like me, the complacent, badly educated, white middle class, that it was the worst thing. It was a genocide, and not to own your own children, not to have any idea, any security in your life at all, plus all the disease and the brutality of the punishments. Don't you dare discount it.
Absolutely. So I think there's a few issues here, I think, that help to create that problem. One is that there's a lack of knowledge about African civilizations and the fact that, poet Mutabaruka from Jamaica talks about slavery being an interruption of African history. And I think one of the things that's important for when teachers teach this part of history, they make sure that they begin with African civilization, so people have an understanding of how people are being taken, kidnapped and trafficked out of these very sophisticated, often, cultures, and people who were then forced to give up pretty much every single part of their culture as part of that dehumanizing process. And I think that's really key. And the other thing that's really important is that it's now learning to interrogate the Scottish Enlightenment and look at Christianity also in a way that means that we need to understand about the racism that, in my opinion, as part of the project. So it's not even a hypocrisy, but it's actually built into that. And it's the same, Christianity in some way, the fact that certain parts of the Bible were used to then justify slavery in this way, so it's
there's many important things. I mean, and the first is that quite clearly the structural racism in the British Empire was certainly by the 90s. I mean, it starts, I think, with people like my ancestors who could not enslave Africans, despite the ditherings of the Christian church, but could not enslave Africans if they thought they were equal human beings, or if they thought they were human beings at all. And it's sort of clear from their letters that they did, and my ancestor knew Hume. I mean, they bought into that philosophical trope about the, and founded their racism, which had permitted them to do it. But then a little bit later, and people like Priyam Gopal and Satnam Sanghera in his brilliant book Empire Land write about this. By the early 19th century, racism was one of the key ruling structures of the English Empire, the British Empire, everywhere, all across the world, setting one tribe against the other. They kind of did it in Scotland, actually, as well. Southern Scots versus Northern Scots. But and you can see, if you go to Kenya, you can see in India, that as the preference for one racial group on completely random terms is still affecting those societies today because it leads to civil war and things like that, and all sorts of abuses. So it's really that is kind of the most important thing to come out of it, because if people go, what is the point in dredging up this past and writing this book? You go, but there's all sorts of arguments which a lot of white people won't care much about, not least making the history available to those who've been denied it for 200 years. But the really important one is to say there is an absolute direct straight line from the racism that was necessary to enslave Africans in the Caribbean to racism and inequality in Britain today. There's a link between BAME people dying at 4 times the rate of COVID that goes back to the structures of transatlantic slavery. And that's why it's important, and you cannot ignore it. You must not ignore it.
And I think the social construction of race is so important for, I'm working with teachers and students to understand that if you know where it's come from, it's much easier to dismantle it. Because I think people do still have this idea of, oh, racism has been around with us for thousands of years and you can't read anything about it. Well, actually, it's about ethnocentric ideas, which then harden into this very definite social construction of race, which comes out of the Enlightenment. It comes out of, ideas of people like David Hume, who then influenced so many other people in the world. And actually, I was just looking at Thomas Jefferson's book from 1780, and it's almost word for word the kind of white supremacist ideas of David Hume he takes, and it's almost word for word, that passage, just a few decades later. So the fact that and we go right back to the Barbados slave code in the 1660s and the other slave codes that are then based on that, the Jamaican one and Virginia and so on.
Yes.
And where it's all absolutely encoded into law, these crazy ideas of racial difference, which has stayed with people as something that, people think that has always been with us. So I think it's so important to get to that point, and then the fact that it was used at that point, especially in places like Virginia, to actually separate white working class people, indentured labourers and enslaved African people coming together to revolt against people who are oppressing them.
And I think bringing up Jefferson is really interesting because what we have to also accept is that some of the heroes of the fights for equality of mankind and rights of man and liberalism, were also up to their necks in this trade. William Gladstone, for example, whose father made all his money out of from being a poor merchant son in Leith to being one of the richest of all of them. I mean, there are many things that my grandfathers and great uncles did that are absolutely appalling. Though, that what they did is also horrifically understandable, in the sense that I might have done the same with peer pressure and so on in the same era. But it's when we get into the 19th century, and I do quote Jefferson in the book because he has a line. Jefferson, of course, is one of the great freedom fighters of the modern era, but also was a slave owner at Monticello. But he wrote, there cannot be, I'm not going to quote this accurately, but there cannot be a man who lives like this, owning other human beings, who is not morally in some way tarnished.
So he knew.
He knew. And I see that happen. My ancestors, particularly the Liberal MP, were very big on their honour and their duty and their and moralizing about what life should be, and then how their children should behave and so on, but then do things you find absolutely extraordinary, and they get worse in the sense in the 19th century because you're now closer to the modern age. So, for an example, Sir Charles Dalrymple Ferguson, who's my 3 times great grandfather, my grandfather's grandfather, who lived at New Hales, the house outside Musselburgh that many Scots will know, now a National Trust property. He was in the 20s in Edinburgh, just as the second abolition movement was getting going. Highly educated man about town. He was studying sciences at the university and also studying to be a lawyer. He was a member of all the discussion clubs where he discussed slavery and the slavery issues. And and a member of the Church of Scotland. He was a member of the Assembly, the governing body of the Church of Scotland. So, which means he would have known people like James Thompson, who is the great Church of Scotland anti-slavery preacher, preached from St. George's Church in George Street in Edinburgh. So he would have known all these people intimately. But when slavery ends in 1834, and he, like all the other slave owners, gets a pile of money equivalent to more than £1 million today as compensation for giving up the enslaved people, he spends it on Christian good works, churches in Ayrshire and on the Fife coast, the Lothian coast, and schools for poor fishermen's children. But he doesn't spend a single penny in Jamaica. and the 200 people, 198 people who were given their freedom are left landless, educationless, while he happily spends the money and gets a monument put up to him for his good works.
Yeah.
And you, at that point, you go, what the hell? Because your friends were abolitionists. The church where you went and prayed had abolitionists in it. How deeply morally tarnished were you that you just couldn't see this? It would have been easy for you. And then also, how does that moral tarnishing go on? How does it affect the generations beyond? And I, early in this project, I talked to a friend who is of color and has a Caribbean heritage, and she said that I really don't, I said, what should I do with this? I've got this material, I think it's an amazing story, but what should I, as me, do with it? And she said, I really don't want to read any more slavery horror stuff. I've had quite enough of that in my life, but I do want to know how you white people are going to heal yourselves, because you are toxified by what happened, and that's a book worth reading, she said. So
definitely. I think, I often think about the men that were engaged in the worst horrors and then leaving the Caribbean, coming back to Scotland and not talking about it really to anyone at all, probably not their wife, not their children, not their family, keeping it all under wraps. But what that does to your kind of psychology and how those kinds of influences warp your personality, dehumanize you as an enslaver, how you then project that, or how you engage with the next generation, and how that goes through your family line. So that's something that I am interested in, how that also affects our culture today, those kinds of toxic ways of behaving that we haven't really examined or healed properly on this end, that are still contributing to misery across the world even now. You know what, Alex, we've got some questions. I don't know if you want to take some. Should we take some now? We have, the first question is, do either of us have thoughts on how we begin to encourage not just those who don't know, but those who don't want to know about our past? I think we've kind of touched on that. I don't know if you've got more to say about it.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, you go. So I grew up, like many people. I'm 60. I grew up probably like many people, knowing nothing about this history throughout until. It sounds really silly to say, I started listening to Bob Marley, when Caribbean reggae became a huge thing in Britain in the late 70s. And then I watched Roots. Yeah. And I remained pretty ignorant, but I kind of never looked back. Yeah. So I think in a way, I mean, the thing about, my book is, it is pitched to people like me who are ignorant, and in a way, and I'm very lucky to have this material, but I also think, we have to keep finding new ways to tell these stories. Books don't sell many copies, so we have to find new ways to tell people of our children and grandchildren's generation, and not be too stuck up and traditionalist about them. But I do think that there is the angry white people of my generation are kind of given up on them. And I think maybe we don't need to waste any time because they are dying off, frankly. What we need to tackle is the England football fans. but the privileged white people who tell me my book, and that tell black people they should shut up and not question the great country that's kind enough to give them a home, and tell people like me not to be traitors to our class and cause unnecessary trouble. There's no winning them over. But they are on their way out, and I think, So that's a bit pathetic, isn't it? I'm saying give up with the older. No,
I mean, maybe it is about concentrating on the younger generation of, the kinds of families that you grew up with, who do have a different outlook on things.
And that's what you do.
Willing to engage with.
I mean, you did brilliant stuff in your work. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, thank you. But it's about bringing people together to have these conversations. And obviously, these are people that want to come, But I think creating more and more opportunities for dialogue. I mean, there've been many, many Caribbean activists. I mean, from the very time so-called emancipation happened, people have been asking for reparations. And there's a question here about reparations, which I'd love us to get onto,
yeah,
actually.
let's do that.
Before we just get onto that point, there is another question that I'm intrigued to know how many Black Fergusons Alex was able to meet in Tobago and Jamaica.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. So I did have an ancestor who was in Tobago for 4 years, and he died there, and he aged 30. So I took DNA testing kits to Tobago and Trinidad, and in fact, the customs officer at Parco Airport in Port of Spain said, I know about DNA testing, but you're looking for a lot of people, because I had dozens of them. But I ended up ringing every Ferguson in the Tobago and Trinidad and Tobago phone book, of which there weren't that many. I mean, there's loads more Campbells, for instance. But and a lot of people sort of thought I was mad. But I ended up having some really great conversations with people. It was a really good way, actually, of randomly meeting people just because you shared a surname. And getting as a journalist, getting a vox pop from a good selection. And I had some great conversations with some amazingly generous, interested people. Sadly, none of the DNA tests came back positive in terms of linking me with them. But I was funny, I have a lot of, I'm a family of a lot of cousins, and it would have been really good, actually, to have connected that. But I did meet some great people with whom I'm still in touch.
And those connections might happen. I think as more people start taking the DNA tests and become more accurate, that might happen down
yeah,
the
and
line.
I go into that a bit in the book. I mean, DNA and the internet, clearly, it's very easy for people like me now to use the internet to find. And if you're a Scot with a surname that's not very ordinary, you can do it very quickly in the University College of London Legacies of British Slavery database. The details of how to do this are in my book. There's really no excuse, given that genealogy is Britain's most popular hobby after golf. There's really no excuse not to have a look if you suspect. And then there are things you might consider doing, which is what we're about to talk about.
Right, which is wonderful. So our other question is, what are your thoughts on redress and reparations? And that's obviously something you thought about a great deal and is part of your book. And you talk about the 10-point plan from CARICOM specifically, but also other grassroots initiatives as well that you started to get involved in and have thoughts about too.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first thought is this is an area where, my instinct is to ask you, Lisa, with a history in your time in the Caribbean. I mean, it's very much something where actually we the heirs of all the nations that enslaved people need to listen. And so if you do listen, and not many people in Europe are, you'll find out very quickly that the CARICOM group of Caribbean nations formally requested the beginnings of reparations and reconciliation talks from the European governments in 2014, 11 European governments. And France and Denmark have sort of started, particularly over Haiti in France's case, doing that. The British government, as David Cameron at the time, just laughed it out of court, get on with it. I think that's shameful. And the headlines in our media were, Caribbean nations want 4.7 trillion in compensation, which wasn't actually it at all. So people laughed a bit more at the cheeky people asking for all our money. And for me, it's an awful it's a shame. It's a humiliation that we haven't even agreed to have the talks. Because I would encourage everyone to do it, to have a look at the 10-point CARICOM reparations plan. It's about good things. It's about reconciliation. It's about technology transfer. It's about collaboration. It may even be about friendship. And there's a lot of reasons why that should be the case. And talking is a good idea, is a good thing. So what I and my family and some other families associated who do have this history have started doing is donating amounts to education organizations and people who and charities that help particularly young people in UK and in the Caribbean, in Jamaica and Tobago. But I mean, these are puny things. I mean, they're tiny sums, and it's almost insulting, really, to say that you can even begin to repay in any way that makes sense for the nearly 1,000 people my family enslaved and all their descendants. But I do think that, and I'm pleasingly, I'm getting quite a lot of email from people who've read about the book and have going, and maybe I need to look at this. You know, we have done some research. That people who do start giving, you know, a few pounds a month for scholarships in Jamaica, where, you know, we basically take all the science and maths teachers and get them to work in the States. So yeah, that is a first step, both in acknowledging, which is really important to people in the Caribbean, and to thinking about the bigger picture and how we can address the fact that these countries to whom we owe so much in blood and money are so much poorer than us. Not even getting vaccinations, most of them, for COVID. So I think, you know, the reparations debate can go in many ways, and it'll take a long time. But there are things we can start doing now, and talking and listening is one of the chief ones too.
I think, yeah, it's about listening, it's about learning, it's beginning of that healing process. But, you know, people have been talking about this for such a long time now that people do want to see very concrete actions. And I think the sooner that we, you know, the fact you're starting to connect with these grassroots organisations is great. And it's something that, you know, Professor Breen Shepherd talks about creating in Jamaica, talking about creating a groundswell amongst the general population as well. And if this can happen in lots of different areas where people have the ability and the means to be able to do that, and the fact that you can set an example to say, look, we have the means to do this. We can actually do this quite easily without actually even sacrificing that much of our lifestyle even. Yes. So we should be leading the way on this and encouraging other people to do it and showing, you know, how this can be done. But like you say, it's about listening to people who are actually working on the ground, who are, I mean, I'm just thinking about, you know, when I used to work for a little while in Grenada as a primary school teacher. So I you know, I spent 20 years in England, 20 years in Grenada, and then 10 years in Scotland. And the 20 years that I was in Grenada, I worked quite a lot with, you know, youth groups, working in primary school for a while. And I think people here don't really quite understand the value of education and how passionately people feel about the value of education. The fact that entire communities come together and celebrate when a child ends up passing their common entrance exam and doing well and going to a secondary school, you know. Now, having said that, something like the structures of having to pass the equivalent of 11 plus, the common entrance exam at 11 or 12 when you go to secondary school, all of that starts creating this pipeline and leaving certain young children behind. So, and it starts to entrench that class structure. So, for example, if you're looking at giving scholarships to Caribbean students, which is fabulous, right? You can do that. But you also have to make sure that you're thinking about, well, when that young person, let's say, gets a scholarship and comes to Scotland, gets a full scholarship, not a partial scholarship, a full scholarship with travel and everything, make it easy to do if you're coming from a working class family. To be able to create certain structures that when you go back to the Caribbean, it's sustainable for that person to be able to stay there, to run a project, to pass on that knowledge to your community, but also work with young children who have the opportunity to flourish, to make sure that their mother, let's say if it's a single parent who has, let's say, 3 children, and you get to September and that mother has to come up with uniforms, new uniforms and school books and all of these things, and sometimes even take out a loan from a bank just to get your child to go to school, which you know generally don't have to pay for. But I think it's about working with grassroots organizations who are well trusted, they're well organized, they just need a bit of capacity, a bit of help, and things that are sustainable, social enterprises which start to then create their own wealth and really build up wealth from the bottom upwards. I think those are the things we definitely have to be concentrating on. We have another question
Can I just come back on that?
Sure. Go ahead.
So just to give an example, so there's a, I should say that I'm not, the proceeds of this book are clearly going to these organisations that my family and others are already supporting it. The book has a website called bloodlegacybook.com, and there's a reparations page on that. And I've listed some of the organisations in Jamaica and in UK that we're already supporting, and and other families who ask me what can we do, at the moment I just pointed at that. Some more suggestions for organisations there, particularly Trinidad and Tobago, where I have very little at the moment, would be really gratefully received. But on that, you'll see there's one example there, which is a school in downtown Kingston in Jamaica called North Street, which I knew about because Sir Jeff Palmer, who many of you know, is a student from North Street who came to England in age 14 from there. And we, several of us, and some other authors who've written on slavery, I know as well, and some members of my family, one of the things our very small amount of money going there is specifically to provide grants for children transitioning from primary to secondary, because, as you've said, there's a poverty issue there where a secondary education is technically free, the books and the uniforms and so on are too much for many parents to do it. So you end up with children not going to secondary from the poorest urban areas. So absolutely right. This is something we have to do from the very beginning. And I visited that school, and I've been to the room with 70 kids in it, partitioned to make 3 classes. Yeah. And I've also talked to the headmistress, who is great, who's wonderful. But she told me, and I heard this in other primary schools in Jamaica, that you cannot get a maths or science teacher for love or money, because they go straight to Canada, Britain, and the US. And it's a really awful irony in a time when we're cutting international aid and we're still taking the skills of African Caribbean people to help us and not recompensing those societies. So I do hope that everyone I encourage to give to this school in Jamaica is also talking to their MP or MSP about not stopping, because we have to allow people to travel for their lives if they wish to, but also making sure that our government recompenses Caribbean governments for every teacher and nurse that we take, who may well never go back. So I think it's campaigning on big and small, the big picture and the small picture. That's the way forward, I think. But again, I really want to hear and be told how to do this properly. I used to work for Oxfam. I have been a white saviour, a liberal white saviour. I worked for Oxfam for 4 years. We don't do the job well. We have to start learning that white saviours are part of the problem, not the solution.
That's, I think, often an issue with, I'm not having a go at Oxfam particularly, but this issue with the idea of aid when it's actually unfair trade practices that are the issue, and the fact that, for example, even in the hotel industry, where a local hotelier has to pay a fat tax and a foreign hotel owner coming in gets a tax holiday for 25 years and importing everything. So it's those kinds of imbalances where markets get flooded with goods from other countries, and people, farmers can't compete, and all those kinds of issues, terrible issues with land ownership and things like that.
The destruction of the Caribbean dairy industry.
Right, exactly. All those things are very, very, very difficult to operate and try and build your country in those kinds of conditions. So I think if people get to understand that and they can put some pressure on the government for fairer trade practices, that's really helpful. Yeah. I also think even the so-called Windrush scandal, where British citizens of Caribbean origin have been treated so appallingly, where there's been deaths and lack of compensation and so on. I think if people can become aware of this and really try to campaign, people who are in positions of power and people who've got powerful networks and can have, they have a certain amount of influence to be able to get on board with those kinds of areas where Caribbean people have been campaigning here and would do well with solidarity from white people, particularly people who are powerful. Yeah. I think it looks like we have 5 minutes to go, and we've got another question here. Should estate owners, for example, whose wealth and property were based on slavery give back, which is what you're doing. And that's what you're encouraging people to do. So.
I'm, I'm sitting in my house in Edinburgh, which is not derived from slavery. I think it's interesting that, because if I look around me and my family, right? There are no visible effects of our slavery ownership among our possessions. But clearly, you look at me, you hear me, you can see a privileged white man from the British ruling class, and the power that came with that wealth enabled my ancestors post-slavery to go on running things. And my father was a Conservative MP, and so I feel that I'm still privileged because of slavery, and I've had advantages in my life that came through the power that came down from the enslavers in my family. How do I pay back for that? Can I pay back for that? I don't know. It's really interesting, and I think clearly I want to. I produced this book, which was 4 years' work, and obviously will not take any profit from it. But that for me was a privilege to do. It's one of the most important things I've done in my life. So I'm hardly going to ask for you to give me a free pass because I've written a book. I don't know. I am thinking about it. I think I probably personally, going forward, I think I probably need to devote a proportion of my income per annum to these kind of causes. And also, just so I'm going to spend a significant amount of my time campaigning for the causes that people from the other end of the story ask me to, whether it's for reparations or for getting vaccines to the nations that Britain colonized. That's my answer. I think it's up to everyone. People like David Harwood, Lord Harwood, whose castle in Yorkshire was built entirely on slavery money, which isn't true of the houses owned by my family. Who has made a full confession and is did it some years ago. Confession is the wrong word, but it's audited it, everything, said, being clear about it, given the records to the university, and now has relationships in Barbados and charitable relationships in Leeds and so on, and says it's one of the best things he's ever done, for his own personal pleasure and happiness. So I would recommend that to people like me. And there are a lot of us. It's not just the people who own the houses. The bankers of Glasgow aren't remembered, but the major money was made in banking and insurers.
That's right.
What do you think, Vicky? I'm going to ask you, what do you think?
So on that note, though, we're going to have to wrap up. But what I'd like to suggest on that note, that we work towards something resembling a festival of ideas, or networking, or have an opportunity to, particularly Caribbean people who are working on the ground and know the issues very, very well, and not Jamaica for sure, because Scotland's had such a strong connection with Jamaica over the years, but not to forget about the smaller islands. The fact that you're working with Tobago and Grenada was another one that was very heavily populated with Scots, St Vincent and so on, but right across the entire region, really, wherever British people, Scottish people particularly were. But to be able to come together and kind of throw out some ideas, to say, well, these are our most pressing needs right now, and other people saying, well, I have an interest, or I have skills in that area, and we can start to match some of these projects, and all part of building this groundswell of normalizing this kind of behavior and these kinds of ways of having these conversations and actions, where we can actually start to equalize and have really kickstart this healing process in a significant way. And people have asked whether the Scottish government are in a position to actually do it independently from the UK government, and who knows what will happen with independence or not. But the fact that if the groundswell really develops within Scotland and encourages the Scottish government, and then the Scottish government, who knows, may have some sort of, may encourage the UK government to start to move a bit more in this direction. That might never happen, but the fact that we can do this as people to people is a really good start, and do something very, very constructive that can see some significant results on the ground in the next few years. It would be wonderful. So it looks like we're going to have to wrap up now. The website has been put on the YouTube chat, so make sure that you have a look at that and see the kinds of projects that Alex is involved in, and other people are really getting off the ground. Don't forget to check for his book, Blood Legacy, and you can go to bookshop.org and go on to the website that connects specifically with this weekend, and make sure and get the book, and remember that all the proceeds are going to be going towards these projects which can make really significant change in people's lives. Well overdue, but it's starting to happen, and I think that we definitely have to keep these conversations going. So anybody who's watching on YouTube, if you want to go on to Twitter as well, and you can always link us into those conversations. Alex, so your Twitter handle is at AX Renton, is that correct?
Yeah, and
AX Renton. Excellent. And if you want to go on to Edin Carib as well, and we can keep the conversation going and see what kinds of ideas that we can bring to fruition.
There's an email address in the website. I would love to hear from people with views on this and ideas for what me and the people like me and people who are getting in touch with me could do as well. Can I just say something quickly for the white people who want to know what to do? Great book I've just been reading, Emma Dabbury's book, What White People Can Do Next. She says it's a deliberately provocative title, but I find it's short and it's beautifully written and really charismatic and useful. I'd like to attach it to the end of my book, actually, but I'm not sure the publishers would like that.
All right, so excellent. So thank you very much, Alex, for being part of this conversation this evening, and I wish you all the luck with it, and I'm sure lots of people are going to get on board and have a really constructive conversation going forward. And so thanks very much to everyone else for tuning into this event at the Scottish Books Long Weekend. Don't forget that tomorrow you've also got 4 more events to tune into, so I hope you'll enjoy those as well. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you all. Thanks, Lisa.